Agent Director Michael Harrison pulled his black sedan into the driveway of 1247 Maple Street and took a deep breath. After 25 years with the FBI, climbing from a rookie agent to the head of the entire organization, he finally had what he'd always dreamed of, a quiet suburban home where he could actually relax on weekends. The house was perfect. 2 stories, white picket fence, and a neighborhood that looked like something out of a movie. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalks. Elderly couples walked their dogs, and everyone seemed to wave at each other. It was exactly what Michael needed after spending his days dealing with the worst criminals in the country. He'd barely finished unloading his first box when he noticed her. A woman in her mid-40s was standing in the yard next door, arms crossed, watching him with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. She had sharp features, perfectly styled blonde hair, and was wearing what looked like expensive workout clothes despite clearly not coming from the gym. Michael gave her a friendly wave, but instead of waving back, she marched straight over to his property line. Her heels clicked against the pavement with military precision. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, looking him up and down like she was conducting an inspection. "I'm Karen Mitchell, HOA Enforcement Coordinator for Willowbrook Estates. We need to talk." Michael set down his box and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Karen. I'm Michael. Just moving in today." Karen didn't shake his hand. Instead, she pulled out a thick binder from seemingly nowhere. "Before you get too settled, there are rules here. Important rules that keep our neighborhood property values high and maintain our community standards." She flipped through pages covered in plastic sleeves, each one containing typed documents that looked more official than most government paperwork Michael had seen. "First, your moving truck. It's been parked on the street for over 2 hours. The limit is 90 minutes for any commercial vehicle." Michael glanced at his watch. He'd started unloading exactly 47 minutes ago. "I think there might be some confusion. I haven't been here that long." "I've been timing it," Karen said firmly, tapping her expensive watch. "And another thing, your mailbox. See how it's positioned? It needs to be exactly 18 inches from the curb. No more, no less. Yours looks like it might be 19 inches. Michael looked at his mailbox, which appeared identical to every other mailbox on the street. "I haven't even checked the mail yet." "That's however the previous owner left it." "Previous violations don't excuse current violations," Karen replied, making a note in her binder. "The HOA doesn't grandfather problems just because someone else created them." For the next 20 minutes, Karen proceeded to explain a dizzying array of rules that apparently governed everything from the exact shade of white his fence could be painted to the specific times he was allowed to mow his lawn. She had rules about garbage can placement, rules about what types of flowers he could plant, and even rules about how many cars he could have in his driveway at one time. Michael listened patiently, drawing on years of experience dealing with difficult people. In his line of work, he'd interrogated terrorists, negotiated with hostage takers, and sat across from some of the most dangerous criminals in America. Karen's aggressive neighborhood monitoring was almost refreshing in its complete lack of actual consequences. "I appreciate you filling me in," Michael said when she finally paused for breath. "I'll make sure to review all the official HOA documents once I'm settled in." Karen's eyes narrowed. "These are the official documents. I've spent 3 years updating and improving our community standards. The old HOA board was far too lenient." "Of course," Michael replied diplomatically. "I'll definitely look everything over." As Karen marched back to her house, Michael couldn't help but smile. He'd dealt with dictators who were less controlling than his new neighbor. But after facing down international criminals and domestic terrorists, surely he could handle one overzealous HOA coordinator. Over the next few days, Michael began to understand just how seriously Karen took her self-appointed role. She seemed to spend most of her time positioned at her front window, watching the neighborhood like a security guard. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she'd emerge from her house with her coffee and binder, conducting what she apparently considered a neighborhood inspection. Michael watched her routine with the same analytical eye he used to study criminal behavior patterns. Karen would walk the entire block, taking notes about everything from slightly crooked welcome mats to garbage cans that were positioned 6 inches too far from the curb.
She'd take photos with a professional-looking
camera and make detailed entries in her ever-present binder. The other neighbors seemed to have adapted to Karen's oversight through a combination of compliance and avoidance. When she approached, People would suddenly remember urgent errands that required them to disappear into their houses. The mailman had started timing his deliveries to avoid her daily inspection rounds. Michael's first real test came on his second Saturday in the neighborhood. He'd decided to wash his car in the driveway, something he'd been looking forward to as a peaceful weekend activity. He was barely 5 minutes into the job when Karen appeared at his property line. "Excuse me," she called out, waving her binder. "I need to stop you right there." Michael turned off his hose and walked over, genuinely curious about what rule he could possibly be breaking by washing his own car on his own property. "Driveway car washing is only permitted between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on weekends," Karen announced, consulting her binder. "It's currently 9:53 a.m. Michael looked at his watch, which showed 9:53 exactly. He had to admire her precision, even if her authority was questionable. "I'll wait 7 minutes then." "That's not how it works," Karen said, clearly frustrated that he wasn't showing proper deference to her authority. "Once you've started an unauthorized activity, you have to wait until the next permitted time period, which would be next Saturday between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Michael nodded thoughtfully. In his professional life, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to handle unreasonable people was to stay calm and ask reasonable questions. "Could you show me where that specific rule is written in the official HOA documents?" Karen's face flushed slightly. "It's in the updated guidelines I've been working on. The old rules were inadequate for maintaining proper community standards." "I see. So these are proposed rules, not current ones. They're improvements that any reasonable person would recognize as necessary." Michael could see that Karen genuinely believed she was helping the neighborhood, even if her methods were questionable. He'd encountered this type of personality before. People who craved control and convinced themselves that their personal preferences were universal truths. "I tell you what," Michael said. "Why don't you give me a copy of the actual current HOA documents and I'll make sure I'm following all the official rules." Karen's grip tightened on her binder. "Fine. But understand that just because something isn't explicitly prohibited doesn't mean it's appropriate for our community." As she stalked back to her house, Michael realized his peaceful retirement neighborhood might be more interesting than he'd expected. But after spending decades dealing with people who posed actual threats to national security, surely he could handle one neighbor with control issues. He waited exactly 7 minutes, then turned his hose back on and continued washing his car, humming quietly to himself. The real trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Michael discovered the first note. He was heading to his car for another day at the FBI headquarters when he spotted a bright yellow paper tucked under his windshield wiper. For a moment, his training kicked in and he scanned the area for potential threats before remembering where he was. The note was typed in bold letters. "Violation notice. Your vehicle was parked at an improper angle relative to the driveway center line. Repeated violations will result in formal HOA action. K. Mitchell, Enforcement Coordinator." Michael looked at his car, which was parked exactly the same way he'd been parking it for 2 weeks. He measured the angle with his eyes, comparing it to his neighbor's vehicles. If anything, his car was straighter than most. He folded the note and put it in his pocket, making a mental note to review the actual HOA documents when he got home. 25 years of investigating complex crimes had taught him the importance of documentation and facts over accusations. That evening, Michael did exactly what he'd promised himself. He dug out the real HOA documents he'd received when buying the house and spread them across his kitchen table. After an hour of careful reading, he found exactly 0 references to vehicle parking angles, car washing time restrictions, or mailbox positioning requirements. What he did find was interesting. The actual HOA had very reasonable rules about major issues like exterior paint colors, fence heights, and noise ordinances. Nothing about the dozens of micro-regulations Karen had been citing. The next morning brought another note, this time about his garbage cans being positioned in a manner inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Michael had placed them exactly where the previous homeowner had left marks on the driveway, and exactly where his neighbors placed theirs. Bobby picked up one of the fake violation notices. Karen had spent hours making them look official, complete with case numbers, legal-sounding language, and multiple carbon copies. "Unauthorized vegetable cultivation in residential zones?" he read aloud. "He planted tomatoes in his backyard without submitting a landscaping plan," Karen explained seriously. Karen, People are allowed to plant tomatoes in their own backyards. Not without proper approval. What if everyone just started planting whatever they wanted? The neighborhood would look like a farm. Bobby was beginning to remember why he usually avoided Karen's calls. But he'd already committed to the plan, and $300 was $300. They spent an hour rehearsing Bobby's performance. Karen had him practice his authoritative voice, his official posture, and his responses to potential questions. She'd anticipated every possible challenge Michael might raise and coached Bobby on how to deflect them back to official procedures and department policy. "Remember," Karen said as Bobby prepared to leave, "the key is confidence. Act like you have every right to be there, like this is completely normal and routine. Don't let him ask too many questions. Just cite the violations and explain the consequences." And what exactly are the consequences supposed to be? Escalating fines, potential legal action, possible removal from the neighborhood? Just keep it vague but scary. As Bobby drove home with his fake police uniform and Karen's elaborate props, he couldn't shake the feeling that this plan was going to backfire spectacularly. But Karen had been so convincing, so certain that this Michael guy needed to be taught a lesson about respecting authority. What Bobby didn't know, and what Karen had never bothered to find out, was exactly what kind of authority Michael was used to dealing with in his professional life. If she had known that her target spent his days coordinating federal investigations and briefing the president on national security threats, she might have reconsidered her strategy. But Karen was so focused on winning their neighborhood battle that she never thought to wonder why Michael seemed so unimpressed by her attempts at intimidation. She'd assumed his calm confidence came from arrogance, not from experience dealing with actual criminals and real threats. Saturday morning was going to be very educational for everyone involved. Saturday morning arrived with perfect suburban weather, sunny, mild and ideal for Karen's planned public demonstration of authority. She positioned herself at her front window at 9:30 a.m., watching the street fill with weekend activity. Kids were riding bikes, neighbors were walking dogs, and several people were working in their yards. Perfect audience, Karen thought to herself as she checked her watch. Bobby should be arriving any minute. Michael was in his backyard, tending to the small vegetable garden that had become the latest source of Karen's complaints. He'd planted tomatoes, peppers, and herbs in neat, well-organized rows. The garden was actually quite attractive, and several neighbors had complimented him on it during their evening walks. He was enjoying the peaceful morning routine when he heard a car door slam in his driveway. Through his side gate, he could see someone in what appeared to be a police uniform walking toward his front door. Michael's training kicked in immediately. In his line of work, unexpected visits from law enforcement could mean anything from a national security briefing to a family emergency. He quickly washed his hands and headed to the front door, mentally running through any recent cases that might require his immediate attention. When he opened the door, his experienced eyes immediately began cataloging details. The man standing on his porch was wearing a police uniform, but something was off. The uniform didn't quite fit right. Too loose in some places, too tight in others. The badge looked wrong too, somehow too shiny and generic. "Good morning," the man said, trying to project authority but coming across as nervous. "I'm Officer, Johnson with the HOA Enforcement Division. I'm here regarding multiple violation reports filed against this property." Michael's eyebrows went up slightly. In 25 years of law enforcement, he'd never heard of an HOA Enforcement Division. More importantly, this man's entire demeanor screamed amateur performance. "HOA Enforcement Division?" Michael asked calmly. "Could you show me your credentials?" Bobby fumbled with the fake ID Karen had created for him. "Of course. Here's my identification and badge." Michael took the ID and examined it with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades authenticating documents. The plastic was wrong, the printing was obviously done on a home computer, and the photo looked like it had been taken with a smartphone. But instead of immediately calling out the deception, Michael found himself genuinely curious about what was happening. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create this elaborate charade. The question was why. "Interesting," Michael said, handing back the fake ID. "I wasn't aware that HOA enforcement had become a police matter. Could you explain what specific violations you're here about?" Bobby consulted the paperwork Karen had prepared. "Well, sir, we've received multiple reports about unauthorized vegetable cultivation, improper vehicle positioning, installation of surveillance equipment without permits, and general non-compliance with community standards. Michael nodded thoughtfully. And who exactly filed these reports? That's confidential department information, Bobby replied, repeating the line Karen had coached him to use. I see. And your department handles these types of violations regularly? Oh, yes, sir. We work closely with homeowner associations throughout the region to maintain community standards and quality of life. Michael was beginning to piece together what was happening. The nervous fake cop, the ridiculous violations, the timing right after his confrontation with Karen. It all pointed to an elaborate scheme orchestrated by his obsessive neighbor. What really amazed him was the amount of effort that had gone into this deception. Someone had spent serious time and money creating fake credentials, printing official-looking documents, and rehearsing this performance. It was actually impressive in its thoroughness, even if it was completely illegal. Officer Johnson, Michael said, would you mind if I called your department to verify this visit? I like to be thorough about these things. Bobby's face went pale. That won't be necessary, sir. This is just a routine violation notice. I just need to cite you for the infractions and explain the potential consequences. What kind of consequences? Fines, possible legal action, potential removal from the neighborhood if violations continue. Michael almost smiled. The idea that anyone could be removed from the neighborhood for planting tomatoes was so absurd it was almost charming. But he was also beginning to feel genuinely concerned about whoever was behind this scheme. Impersonating a police officer was a serious federal crime, even if the police officer was fictional. Before we go any further, Michael said calmly, I think I should probably show you something. Would you mind waiting here for just a moment? Bobby nodded, relieved to have a break from Michael's surprisingly direct questions. He had expected the guy to be intimidated by the uniform and authority, not asking for department verifications and credentials checks. Michael disappeared into his house and returned a moment later carrying a leather wallet. He opened it and held it out for Bobby to see. Bobby found himself staring at an FBI badge and identification card. A real one. The kind he'd seen in movies but never in person. His mouth went dry as he read the name. Director Michael Harrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Officer Johnson, Michael said quietly. I think we need to have a different conversation now. Bobby's fake radio clattered to the ground as his hand started shaking. The color drained completely from his face as the full implications of the situation hit him. He wasn't just impersonating a police officer anymore. He was impersonating a police officer to the head of the FBI. Sir, This isn't... I can explain, Bobby stammered. I'm sure you can, Michael said, maintaining his calm, professional tone. But first, I think you should know that impersonating a law enforcement officer is a federal crime. Even a fictional law enforcement officer. From her window, Karen watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. The conversation was taking much longer than she'd expected, and Bobby seemed to be acting very strangely. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but Bobby looked like he was about to faint. Then she saw Michael show Bobby something from his wallet, and Bobby's entire posture changed. He went from nervous but trying to maintain authority to what looked like complete panic. Oh no, Karen whispered to herself. What's happening? Back on the porch, Michael was making a decision about how to handle the situation. His first instinct was to arrest Bobby immediately and launch a full investigation. But looking at the terrified man in the ill-fitting costume, he sensed this was more stupidity than malice. Why don't you tell me who really sent you here? Michael suggested. And please understand that lying to a federal agent is also a crime. Bobby's voice came out as barely a whisper. It was Karen Mitchell, your neighbor. She hired me to scare you about HOA violations. She said you were being disrespectful and needed to learn about consequences. Karen hired you to impersonate a police officer? She said it wasn't really impersonating because HOA police don't actually exist, so I was just creating a new kind of officer. Bobby knew how ridiculous it sounded as he said it. Michael looked over at Karen's house and saw her face pressed against the window, watching the scene with obvious anxiety. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. The escalating harassment, the made-up violations, and now this elaborate attempt to intimidate him into compliance. What's your real name? Michael asked. Bobby Mitchell. I'm Karen's cousin. Sir, I really need this job. I really needed the money. I'm not a criminal, She made it sound like you were some kind of problem neighbor who needed to be taught a lesson. Michael found himself in an unusual position. Technically, he should arrest Bobby immediately and file federal charges. But he could see that Bobby was more victim than perpetrator. Someone who'd been manipulated into a stupid scheme by Karen's obsessive need for control. "Bobby," Michael said, "I want you to walk over to Karen's house right now and tell her to come outside. Tell her exactly who I am and what just happened. Can you do that?" Bobby nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Should I take off the uniform first?" "No, leave it on. I think Karen needs to see the full consequences of her planning." As Bobby stumbled across the yard toward Karen's house, Michael noticed that several neighbors had gathered to watch the commotion. Word was going to spread quickly through Willowbrook Estates that their newest resident wasn't just any regular retiree. Karen opened her door before Bobby could knock, her face a mixture of confusion and growing dread. "What happened?" she demanded. "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Did you sight him? Did he apologize?" "Karen," Bobby said, his voice shaking. "He's the head of the FBI. We just tried to impersonate a police officer to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Karen stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just said. Then she looked across the yard at Michael, who was standing calmly on his porch, watching their conversation with professional interest. The head of the FBI. Her problem neighbor who didn't respect her authority was the head of the FBI. All of her elaborate schemes, all of her attempts to intimidate him, all of her violations, notices, and threats. She'd been directing them at one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. "Oh," Karen said faintly. "Oh no." Michael watched as Karen slowly walked across the yard toward him, her face pale and her usual confident stride replaced by the hesitant steps of someone approaching their own execution. Bobby followed behind her like a condemned man walking to the gallows, still wearing his ridiculous fake police uniform. The gathering crowd of neighbors had grown larger, with people emerging from houses up and down the street to witness what was clearly becoming the most interesting Saturday morning Willowbrook Estates had ever seen. "Mr. Harrison," Karen began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "Director Harrison," Michael corrected gently, "and I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all. I think you hired your cousin to impersonate a police officer and intimidate me into following rules you made up yourself." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. It wasn't supposed to be what, illegal? Because impersonating a law enforcement officer is a federal crime, Karen. Creating fake badges and identification is a federal crime. Using fraudulent authority to threaten and intimidate people is a federal crime. Bobby looked like he might actually pass out. "Sir, how much trouble are we in? I mean, legally speaking?" Michael considered the question seriously. "Well, Bobby, impersonating a federal officer carries a maximum penalty of 3 years in prison. Creating fraudulent law enforcement credentials is another federal charge. Conspiracy to commit fraud could add more time." Several neighbors gasped. Helen Rodriguez, the actual HOA president, had arrived and was staring at the scene in disbelief. "However," Michael continued, "I'm inclined to believe that this was more stupidity than criminal intent. Karen, you've been harassing me for weeks with made-up violations and fake authority. This was just an escalation of behavior that was already completely out of line." Karen found her voice again, desperation making her words come out in a rush. "I was just trying to maintain community standards. Someone has to care about keeping this neighborhood nice. I never meant for it to go this far." "You never meant to get caught," Michael replied calmly. "There's a difference." Helen stepped forward, her face red with embarrassment. "Director Harrison, on behalf of the actual Homeowners Association, I want to apologize for this entire situation. Karen has been told repeatedly that she has no official authority, but she's ignored every attempt we've made to curtail her behavior. I appreciate that. Helen, I understand you've been dealing with this problem for a while." Michael looked around at the assembled neighbors, many of whom were hearing about Karen's unauthorized enforcement activities for the first time. He could see a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and relief on their faces. Relief that someone had finally stood up to Karen's increasingly aggressive tactics. "Here's what's going to happen," Michael announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Bobby, you're going to go home, burn that fake uniform, and never pretend to be a law enforcement officer again. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Bobby said immediately. Absolutely. Never again. Karen, you're going to stop harassing everyone in this neighborhood with your made-up rules and fake authority. You're going to apologize to every neighbor you've bothered with your violation notices and threats. And you're going to work with Helen to understand what the actual HOA rules are, and limit yourself to those. But what about community standards? Karen asked weakly. What about maintaining property values? Michael gestured around the street. Look around, Karen. This is a beautiful neighborhood full of people who take pride in their homes. They don't need you to force them to care about their properties. They already do. And if I refuse? Karen asked, a flicker of her old defiance returning. Michael's expression didn't change, but his tone became noticeably cooler. Then I file federal charges against both of you and let the justice system sort it out. Your choice. The fight went out of Karen completely. What kind of apology do you want? I want you to go to every house on this street and explain that you had no authority to enforce the rules you were making up. I want you to admit that you created fake violations and threatened people with fake consequences. And I want you to promise to limit yourself to actual HOA business in the future. Helen stepped in. Actually, Director Harrison, I think it would be better if Karen resigned from any HOA involvement entirely. The board has been discussing this for months. Karen looked stricken. You can't kick me out of the HOA. I live here too. We're not kicking you out of the HOA, Helen explained patiently. We're just removing you from any position of responsibility within it. You can still attend meetings and vote on issues, but you can't enforce rules or speak for the organization. Michael nodded approvingly. That sounds reasonable. Karen, do you accept these terms, or would you prefer to discuss this matter with federal prosecutors? I accept, Karen said quickly. I'll apologize to everyone. I'll stop the enforcement activities. I was just trying to help. I believe you were, Michael said. And for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine sympathy. But help that nobody asked for and that exceeds your authority isn't actually help. Karen, it's harassment. Over the next hour, the crowd gradually dispersed as neighbors returned to their weekend activities, but not before most of them had stopped to introduce themselves to Michael and welcome him properly to the neighborhood. Several people apologized for not standing up to Karen sooner, explaining that they'd been avoiding confrontation rather than
Dealing with the problem? Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down brought him homemade
cookies and thanked him for finally doing something about that woman. The Johnsons from across the street invited him to their weekly barbecue. Even the teenagers who lived next door to Karen stopped by to shake his hand and tell him how relieved they were. As the excitement died down, Michael found himself reflecting on the irony of the situation. He'd moved to Willowbrook Estates specifically to escape the stress and conflict of his professional life, only to find himself dealing with a different kind of law enforcement issue in his own backyard. But there was something satisfying about resolving a problem so cleanly and definitively. In his day job, cases often dragged on for months or years with complex legal proceedings and uncertain outcomes. This situation had been resolved in a single morning with clear consequences and immediate results. Later that afternoon, Karen appeared at his door looking thoroughly humbled. She'd changed out of her usual power outfit into simple jeans and a t-shirt, and she was carrying a handwritten letter. Director Harrison, she said formally, I wanted to deliver my written apology personally and let you know that I've spoken with all the neighbors. I also wanted to thank you. Thank me? For handling this the way you did. You could have arrested us both and ruined our lives. Instead, you gave us a chance to make things right. Michael studied her face, looking for signs that this was just another manipulation, but Karen seemed genuinely chastened, her usual aggressive confidence replaced by what appeared to be real remorse. Everyone deserves a second chance. Karen, just make sure you use yours wisely. As Karen walked away, Michael went back to his vegetable garden. His tomatoes were coming along nicely, his security cameras were recording properly, and his car was parked at whatever angle felt comfortable. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, he felt like he might actually get that peaceful retirement he'd been looking forward to. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm over the following weeks. Karen kept to herself mostly, tending her own garden and avoiding eye contact with neighbors she'd previously harassed. Bobby never returned to the neighborhood, presumably having learned his lesson about getting involved in his cousin's schemes. And Michael finally got to enjoy those quiet weekend mornings he'd always dreamed of, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the best way to handle a neighborhood bully is to let them discover just how little authority they actually have. The story became legendary in local law enforcement circles, a reminder that you never know who your neighbors might be, and that real authority doesn't need to announce itself with fake badges and made-up rules. Michael's vegetable garden flourished unmolested, producing the best tomatoes Willowbrook Estates had ever seen.